My name is Maya Alvarez, and I am 31 years old. For as long as I can remember, my role in my family was written for me before I could even speak. The one who cooked and cleaned, the one who made everyone else look good while I stayed in the background. At holiday dinners, I wrapped my hands around steaming pots while my sister smiled and took the compliments. At corporate gatherings, I set the table and cleared plates while they praised someone else for the hospitality. That night, when my mother called me at 9 asking me to prepare a last-minute dinner for a visiting executive with just 18 hours notice, I could have said yes, as I always did. Instead, I closed the door on the script they had rehearsed for me and booked a flight. I left a kitchen full of expectations, and I walked toward a single meeting that would change everything. What happened next did not only reassign the roles at our table, it exposed a truth about reputation and power that left the family reeling and one CEO speechless. If stories about being underestimated and then vindicated speak to you, please like and subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from. Now, let me take you back to the phone call that started it all, and to the smell of garlic and lemon my mother thought would save the night. My mother, Linda, had always managed gatherings like a general on parade, precise and cool. Her voice on the phone was measured, but it carried the usual assumption that I would rearrange my life to meet her needs. I could hear clinking cutlery and the faint radio in the background, the same music that had underscored 1,000 evenings where I disappeared into the kitchen. She listed the demands as if reading a brief. 7 courses, 9 guests, a centerpiece that matched the antique porcelain, and most importantly, the guest of honor would be someone she called an important connection for the family. I remember the way the kitchen linoleum stuck to my bare feet, the feel of a damp towel in my hand, the metallic tang of the lemons I had sliced earlier. I remember my pulse contrasting with the steady rhythm of the radio as I listened to her speak in a voice that left no room for refusal. 24 hours for this, she said. You can do it, Maya, she said. I paused, and for a second, the world narrowed to the phone in my hand and the ticket confirmation email that had arrived earlier that morning for a meeting I could not postpone. The meeting was not a small one. It was to discuss an acquisition that would secure jobs for dozens of people at the startup I had helped build from a cramped rented office into a company with 40 employees and a pipeline of clients that was finally turning profitable. The opportunity, if it closed, could change the company from local to national. It could change me from the invisible woman behind their table to the executive on a stage. I put the towel down, swallowed, and I said no. Silence on the line, then shock, then the vocabulary of hurt that families keep in reserve for those who deviate from the script. For the first time, the word selfish left her mouth. For the first time, I felt the kitchen air as if I were breathing it for myself. I will not pretend that the decision was neat or purely noble. It was messy, charged, and visceral. Packing my bag, I felt the weight of 1,000 dinners, 1,000 nights of unnoticed work, and a strange lightness as well, as if removing a heavy cloak I had worn for years. I remember the sound of my suitcase wheels over the tile, the taste of the coffee I drank cold as I skimmed emails, and the smell of the lemon rind left on the counter like a small accusation. At the airport security line, a woman ahead of me dropped her boarding pass and laughed at herself. The laugh landed oddly inside me as a permission. I texted my assistant, Jason, that I was leaving and asked him to hold down the fort, to run the presentation, and to lead the meeting if I could be reached. I felt the plane lift with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. I was choosing my future in small increments. 1 flight, 1 presentation, 1 refusal to fulfill the role assigned to me. Before I continue, I want to pause and say something to you, because if you are watching this, you might be holding one of these 2 things: an obligation that keeps you small, or a chance that requires you to say no. If you have ever had to choose between pleasing your family and protecting your career, I want to hear from you. In the comments, start your reply with "I chose," and then tell us what you chose and how it felt. Your words will help others who are walking a similar line, and I read every comment. Now I will go back to the story and to the evening when my mother assumed she could impress a visiting CEO with porcelain and pomegranate glaze. My backstory is not a short one. I grew up in a compact apartment above a bakery, with the smell of sugar settling into the curtains and the noise of ovens clocking my childhood. My father, Robert, worked long shifts, and my mother, Linda, translated every social occasion into a list that someone had to execute. From a young age, I was praised for being reliable, which in our household meant being ever ready to step in and fix what others neglected. In school, I learned to perform well under pressure and to do invisible labor efficiently. I was the one who brought lunches to classmates and who rewrote presentations for group projects so the lead student could shine. At 20, I started my first company with 2 other founders and a borrowed laptop. At 24, I signed my first client with a modest retainer. And at 28, the company expanded into a small office and we hired our first employees. The work was grueling and beautiful, and it taught me that competence was the only language that mattered in the room. Yet competence did not translate into recognition at home. My sister Emma, photogenic and quick with a joke, got invites and compliments. My brother Mark was the son who could charm the neighbors at Sunday barbecues. They did not have to list their deeds and chores because the narrative assigned to them was already flattering. I became skilled at shrinking myself to make room for the narratives of others. When I look back, I can see a pattern of small requests that added up to a life I did not sign up for. Hosting an entire family reunion the week my main investor was visiting, staying behind to manage a sick aunt while my mother attended a gala, canceling a trip to pick up a last-minute dessert tray for a dinner where the family introduced their so-called important friends to each other. Those moments were punctuated by tangible markers of my professional self. I have an office with 40 people who rely on salaries, quarterly reports that showed steady growth, mentions in industry roundups, and a handful of small profiles that hinted at momentum. Still, I was the one who knew how to fold napkins into swans and to plate fish with a lemon wedge positioned just so. Naming these things does not erase the love I have for my family, but it does clarify why the expectation that I would always be available was not simply about love. It was about an assumption that my own life was negotiable. The people who populate this story are not caricatures. Linda, my mother, controls the party logistics, and her admiration of status has shaped our social calendar. Robert, my father, prefers to remain quiet and supportive in public. Emma, my sister, is quick to seize the spotlight. Mark, my brother, deflects attention with humor. Jason, my assistant, manages operations and knows my calendar better than anyone. Olivia Chen is the CEO of the company, in talks with mine. Victoria Hale is the executive my mother hoped to impress. Maria, the neighbor, witnessed the scene at dinner and later became an unexpected ally. Daniel, my cousin, forwarded messages to everyone and exacerbated the fallout. I tell you these names because the actions they take are specific, and because the truth of what happened depends on people who could be named, and who had stakes of their own. The request that night was precise and monstrous in its smallness. My mother called and asked me to prepare the whole meal in less than a day for a woman she described as a potential connection for the family. She was looking to impress Victoria Hale, a well-known executive who often attended industry galas and who had influence in certain nonprofit boards my mother admired. Here, the stakes were personal and performative. At the same time, there was the professional stake that made the choice sharp. The meeting I had scheduled in another city could finalize a contract that would guarantee payroll for the quarter and might attract an investor who had been hovering for months. At the airport, I felt both currents pulling me. I unpacked my laptop and opened the slide deck and spent the flight rehearsing the data and the narrative that would convince the board. I felt the plane's vibrations under my hands and the dry, recycled air on my skin as I scrolled through projected numbers and cash flow analyses. The checklist in my phone glowed with bullet points, and the smell of my own anxiety tasted like pennies. But the image of the kitchen at home and my mother listing dishes kept intruding. I rehearsed the refusal in my head and the exact phrasing that would be unavailable to retreat. I thought of my team and of what it felt like to be responsible for other people's livelihoods. The morning of the meeting, I landed and walked through thick downtown fog that felt like a curtain closing me into another scene. I rode an elevator that hummed and smelled faintly of coffee and cleaner, and met with my co-founder Daniel briefly to align strategy. We stood in a small glass room under fluorescent lights, and he readied the laptop and printed versions of the contract. I remember the tactile feel of the printed agreement paper under my fingertips and the dry rasp of the stapler as I secured copies. In the hallway before the meeting, Jason sent me a text that read, "Maya, are you sure you want to go? My mother will be furious." I typed back, "I cannot both cook their dinner and save my company," and then I hit send before I could over-explain. In the conference room, Olivia Chen arrived in a tailored navy suit and a quiet energy that did not need noise to command attention. She looked at the slide deck as if scanning a map, and then looked at me and said, "I am glad you could make it." For a moment, the room smelled of citrus and expensive coffee, and I felt the gravity of being seen for my work. The meeting moved through questions about revenue and customer retention, and then to the clause that would secure local marketing support if we hit certain milestones. It all had the sterile, bright quality of corporate rooms, but under that sterility ran a pulse of possibility. I need to be clear about the contract because it explains why I made the choice I did. The agreement on the table was a term sheet valued at $2 million in potential revenue over 2 years, contingent on expansion support in a mutual marketing clause. It outlined milestones quarterly and stipulated an equity conversation after the first year. This was not a handshake. It was a structure with deliverables and legal timelines that would translate into salaries and stability for the team. The term clauses required signatures from both boards and a non-disclosure provision until the merger was announced. I discussed the timeline with my legal counsel and with Olivia's team in a meeting that was precise and almost clinical. Explaining the mechanics of a contract may dry the story, but it is necessary to show what was at stake: jobs that depended on this round, momentum that would be lost if delayed, and the concrete measures that move a startup from survival mode to scale. After the presentation, Olivia asked questions that cut to capacity and cadence and then to leadership. She asked who on our team was responsible for scaling and what support we needed. When I answered that question, something shifted in the room. Several people looked at me and then at the deck, and an energy of possibility spread through the space. Olivia paused and said, "I like your candor and your plan. If we move forward, I would want you to lead the implementation." The words lodged in me like a pulse. Back home, the scene my mother had been preparing for unfolded with a different kind of noise. The table was set with the china polished to a glow, and a television murmur from the living room mixed with the sound of a cork popping. Emma had on a dress and a laugh that made everyone else look comfortable in the light. Mark circulated and told jokes to keep the mood easy. My cousin Daniel had invited a few acquaintances, and the house smelled of lemon and rosemary and the faint burn of 2 hot pans. My absence registered as a disruption and then as a betrayal. Someone texted my mother a question about the salad, and she sent a curt reply that said Maya would be here to handle it. When the night crested with the arrival of Victoria Hale, everyone settled into the performance that social capital demands. The moment of collision came when a pizza delivery arrived instead of the anticipated final course. Somehow, the wrong order had been placed, a sequence of small errors that culminated in what my mother later called a disaster. The pizza boxes were set on the antique tablecloth, and the grease spread like a stain across the formal arrangement. Laughter at first, then a sharp intake of breath from one of Victoria's guests. My mother turned crimson, so used to controlling impressions that the loss of control felt like a fracture. Text messages began to fly around the room, illuminating faces in the dim. Someone recorded a short clip of the pizza atop the plates and posted it. It to a closed group where family and friends habitually shared glimpses of private life with a performative brush. The video, though small, would be the spark that set off a chain. There are 3 moments in this story that tightened like a wire and vibrated with tension, and each deserves to be held in detail. The first is the instant I said no to my mother. For a beat, her silence on the line was like a held breath. I could hear the radio in her kitchen, but also her breathing on the phone. The refusal felt like an incision of reality into that domestic rhythm, a small act of defiance that echoed louder than either of us expected. I felt my palms go cool and a buzzing behind my eyes, as if sound had retreated and small focused images remained, the citrus on the cutting board, the ticket confirmation on my phone, and my own voice saying, "I cannot." The second moment is on the plane as the engines rose and the city receded. The mix of fear and possibility tasted metallic, and the list of things I might lose scrolled like a film reel. I pressed my fingers into my thighs until the sensation grounded me. The third is when the pizza appeared on the fine china, an absurdist tableau. Grease pooled like ink, and the social performance my mother curated seemed to crack visibly. At that table, a quiet humiliation began to transform into public scrutiny. Each of these moments is a pressure point, and in them, the story bends toward change. When the footage of the pizza on the porcelain circulated among family groups, it did more than embarrass. It crystallized a narrative my mother had worked to maintain, and it invited commentary. Someone in the group, Daniel, in a text I would later trace back, wrote a message with a bit too much relish about the chaos. That message found a way into a private text thread that included a mutual contact of Victoria's who misinterpreted the video as evidence of disorganization rather than an anecdote of logistics gone wrong. The ripple traveled outward. Meanwhile, I was in the boardroom, about to close signatures, and my phone buzzed with escalating messages. At first, they were accusatory. Then they grew more frantic. Jason called me in the middle of the meeting and said the clip is everywhere and they are tagging Victoria. I felt the room tilt. Olivia looked up from the deck and said, "Is everything okay?" I stepped into the hallway and listened to my phone light up with texts and missed calls. My mother called and delivered a kind of condensed fury that had been stored for years, now unleashed in sharp syllables. "You left us," she said. "You could have been here." The accusation landed like a stone. I did not engage on the phone. Instead, I returned to the room and instinctively shifted my tone toward the immediate. I said, "To Olivia, we have a clause in the term sheet about reputational risk and transparency, and I offered to accelerate a joint press plan that would manage any misinterpretations." Olivia listened and then suggested we postpone the public announcement until we could ensure messaging alignment. The pragmatic response diffused the immediate danger and allowed the contract to proceed. In the hours that followed, the narrative multiplied. The family group messages swelled with opinions and accusations. Cousins and neighbors took positions, and the private friction became social currency. My sister Emma accused me of grandstanding, which added a different sting. The idea that choosing my career was selfish in the exact same breath as accusing me of showboating. My father Robert texted a short line that read, "Keep your head." It felt like an anchor. At the same time, the company response required delicacy. We drafted talking points and a coordinated release about community programs and a plan to emphasize the jobs the acquisition would protect. Our legal counsel added language to the effect that the agreement required mutual cooperation on public disclosures. The legal phrasing is dry, but it mattered because it turned an emotional argument into a practical condition for the deal. I remember the tactile feeling of signing pages and the sound of the conference room door closing behind us as signatures were exchanged. The CEO, Olivia, shook my hand in a way that did not require noise and said, "I admire your resolve." At that moment, a photograph from the Forbes-style shoot I had done months earlier, which showed me inside a workshop overlaying the headlines, was pulled into circulation by someone on the other side of the acquisition discussion and posted publicly on a corporate blog. The juxtaposition of that image with the family video created a striking contrast, one image of competence and one image of domestic chaos. The contrast reframed the story in a way that magnified its stakes. The boardroom scene that followed the public release is one of the pivotal beats of this story. The room was glass and bright and smelled faintly of furniture polish and strong coffee. There were about 12 people at the table, including Olivia, myself, several representatives from the acquisition team, the legal lead, and a corporate communications director named Serena, who would later become important in shaping the narrative. The conversation was a mixture of technical clauses and personal poise. It opened with a series of standard questions, then moved quickly into how leadership would present the integration. At one point, Victoria Hale entered the room unexpectedly for a courtesy visit, and the sound of her heels on the tile carried a kind of weight. Her face, when she saw me, was inscrutable, and the air felt thin. Dialogue in that room was careful and deliberate. Olivia said, "Maya has been leading implementation, and she is the logical person to continue." Victoria replied, "We value predictability and social standing, and the last thing we need." I responded by explaining our plan to mitigate reputational questions and by showing a timeline of milestones with targeted media placements and community impact measures. Victoria asked about the leadership structure, and I answered directly, pointing to operational milestones and a dedicated communications cadence. The exchanges were precise and multiple, close to 10 direct back and forths in that moment alone, as we negotiated both contract language and the story that would be told publicly. The room listened as details about payroll, retention bonuses, and a shared marketing fund were discussed. In the middle of the conversation, a slide was projected that included my name as lead for the integration, and the boardroom snapped slightly, as if seeing my name in print made something irreversibly true. I felt a quick heat behind my ears and then a steady calm as Olivia looked at Victoria and said, "We move forward with the agreed plan, and Maya will lead." Victoria's lips pressed into a line, and she left shortly after without a clear sign of approval. The signatures went in place and the deal proceeded, yet the social fallout at home would not be contained by corporate documents. The week after the agreement closed was chaotic on many levels. Family dynamics intensified. There were late-night messages, silent dinners, and the kind of small social punishments families deploy when someone breaks an unspoken rule. My mother stopped inviting me to certain gatherings, and when she did, she spoke less to me than to others. Emma posted a vacation photo tagged with a location I might have visited if I had stayed. On the company side, the acquisition integration began, and with it the cleanup of assumptions. We held town halls, and I stood in front of the team and described the timeline and the benefits. I felt their faces as if they were weather, some cloudy, some sunny, and I understood that for them, this deal meant security. The press coverage arrived, and the Forbes-style piece that had been updated with the corporate blog shot of me as the lead person in the story created a public narrative I had not sought, but that felt like recognition. The juxtaposition of domestic images and corporate profiles laid bare the tension I had lived with for years. There are 3 clear tension sections in the middle of this story that I will slow down for because they define the emotional arc. The first is the phone call from my mother after the contract signed, where she accused me of abandoning the family and said, "You chose money over us." Her words were precise and designed to wound. The second is the moment the internal company town hall ended and employees crowded around me asking practical questions about their jobs and benefits, and one young developer began to cry with relief that we were safe. The third is a video conference where Victoria unexpectedly asked whether our leadership could maintain the image of stability, and I answered in a way that tied together operational metrics and personal boundaries. Each of these moments required different muscles: the capacity for compassion under grief, the capacity to reassure, and the capacity to hold firm on what I would no longer do. The fallout in public was tangible. The video of the pizza made rounds in social circles, and a few casual posts from acquaintances turned into commentary in a neighborhood forum, which then attracted attention from a local lifestyle reporter. The reporter sent an inquiry, and the family was suddenly facing interviews. While the company prepared a controlled statement, the family faced the rawness of personal relationships being aired. Some friends of my mother expected an apology from me, public and private. I offered an apology only for the part where I had not been able to fulfill the last-minute request, and I clarified that my absence was because of a professional obligation that affected many people. This did not land well with everyone. Yet the corporate narrative, supported by the acquisition announcement and the public profile pieces, created a new lens through which other people began to see the situation. Suddenly, the question was not whether I had been a good daughter, but whether the family had been fair to expect indefinite availability from someone who had built a company and a team. The conversation shifted. In the weeks that followed, a small subset of family members reached out to negotiate. My mother asked to meet, and I set boundaries. We met at a quiet cafe where the smell of roasted beans cut through the tension. We spoke, and I said I would not accept being treated as a servant in my own family. She cried, and I listened, and then I outlined terms for any future help. Those terms included formal notification at least 7 days in advance for any event requiring my labor, compensation for professional-level work done for family events if it exceeded ordinary tasks, and a commitment to respect my time and role. The specificity shifted the tone from accusation to negotiation. My father, Robert, agreed to act as an intermediary for a transitional period, and Emma offered to help staff events for a modest fee if needed. Some people were offended by the terms. Others breathed a sigh of relief that boundaries were being named out loud. 1 month later, the landscape looked different. The acquisition had been integrated into our operations, and payroll was secure for the next quarter. The team celebrated with a small gathering, and the mood was one of cautious optimism. At home, the distance was still there, but negotiation had begun. My mother had attended one dinner and kept a polite distance. The neighborhood conversations cooled when the lifestyle reporter published a piece that centered the company story and only briefly mentioned the domestic hiccup. The Forbes-style profile had been shared widely, and with it came messages from people who identified with my path. Invitations to speak at a small industry event arrived, and with them, a new platform. The first month epilogue feels like this: a fragile repair and a new normal starting to form. 3 months into the story, more concrete healing and consequences were visible. The company had implemented an integration plan, and we had retained 90% of staff. Our revenue growth accelerated, and a couple of new contracts signed in the wake of the acquisition set a tone of confidence. The public narrative had largely reframed me as an entrepreneur and a leader. Within the family, a few people continued to distance themselves. However, the terms I had proposed were being followed in practice. My mother and I attended a family therapy session together, which was awkward at first and then productive as we learned to name the unspoken rules that had governed us. Emma and I had a frank conversation that led to her acknowledging the difference in our life choices and to a new arrangement where she would manage certain family events for a fee if my professional schedule conflicted. The 3-month mark felt like momentum, with a human cost, but also with clearer boundaries and more explicit agreements. By the 6-month mark, the story had evolved into something both larger and smaller than I expected. The company moved into a satellite office in a new city, and I found myself dividing time between 2 locations. The team celebrated a successful quarterly report, and the investors expressed confidence in the new structure. Media interest shifted to case studies about leadership and boundary setting, and I was asked to be part of a panel about women in leadership. Financially, the contract had produced the expected runway, and we were in the process of hiring a director of operations to manage some of the load I had carried. In the family, the atmosphere normalized further. My mother and I had found a new pattern. We negotiated a schedule and a set of explicit asks. I occasionally cooked for family events by choice and with agreed compensation when the work resembled professional service. Some relatives continued to criticize, but the most important change was that my professional life had a seat at the table of decisions. People called me Maya, with a name that had weight in different contexts, and the family gradually adjusted to that. The 6-month snapshot included concrete outcomes: a stable company, clearer family agreements, and a public profile that reframed the narrative from personal failure to professional agency. Along the way, I learned practical lessons that are worth naming as terms for anyone who finds themselves in a similar position. First, set boundaries in clear language and treat them as contractual. Second, translate care labor into time and, when appropriate, into compensation. Third, build a public narrative proactively so private messages do not fill the vacuum. Fourth, find allies both inside and outside your family to buffer the social repercussions. These are not magical solutions, but they are practical steps that translate emotional labor into actionable policy. There are a few final things I want to make explicit because the shape of this story matters. The contract was real, and it saved jobs and secured momentum for the company. The acquisition closed with a term sheet that required mutual press coordination and which included clauses protecting employee retention and liability coverage. The legal wording documented both responsibilities and allowed us to hold each other accountable. On the family side, I asked for boundaries and received partial compliance. Some relationships healed fully, and others changed into something different. The woman my mother hoped to impress, Victoria Hale, did not become an ally, and in some moments she was a complicating presence who preferred predictability. Olivia Chen, the CEO, became a quiet champion who recognized ability and invited me to lead. These names matter because they are specific actors who made choices. If you are somewhere in the middle of a similar story, here are two things I will say to you. One, you can set boundaries and still love the people around you. Setting boundaries is not necessarily mean. It is a way to care for your own life so you can remain present for others without being consumed. Two, authority can be quiet and persistent. You do not need a spectacle to be recognized. You need evidence, competence, and the willingness to walk toward risk when it matters. The evening the pizza landed on my mother's table was humiliating, but it also crystallized an old pattern. The contract I signed did not magically fix emotional wounds, but it changed the ledger of my life and forced a conversation that had been avoided for years. If this story resonated with you and you want to help others who are choosing themselves, please share your experience in the comments, beginning with "I chose" and telling us what you chose. If you liked this video, please hit subscribe and share it with someone who might need permission to set a boundary or to pursue their work. There are more stories about people who stepped away from invisible roles and into leadership here on this channel, and I will be sharing more of those in the weeks to come. Thank you for listening, and remember, naming your value is the first step to having others respect it.